Black people have had to have the conversation with our sons, with our daughters, about how we are supposed to proceed. So we have to live in a tight box and always be careful.
The group coming together and calling themselves Black Lives Matter. For me, that was like such a tender, heartfelt phrase. I'm tearing up right now. Like, do we really need to say that? It got read by so many people as, oh, are you saying the rest of us don't matter?
Debby Irving, welcome to the Bookaholic podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yes, glad to have you. Well, your book, when I received it in the mail, I was just like, wow, okay, so this is really big. And this is an issue that America just cannot get away from. So going step by step, the name of your book is Waking Up White, Finding Myself in the Story of Race. That alone is an impactful title. So let's dive in. Why did you want to write this book? What was your aha moment? What was it that did it for you that you had to write this book?
Yeah, so important to note, I wasn't a writer. I was an elementary school teacher.
Oh, okay.
You know, what motivated me? I wrote the book that I wish someone had put in my hands when I was in my 20s, or better yet, put in my parents' hands so they could have raised me differently. The big aha moment for me didn't come until age 48. I'm 64. I just turned 64 this weekend. I have to get used to saying that. But I was 48 years old, and I had grown up in a suburb north of Boston, an affluent suburb. I call it my white bubble. Looked like a Norman Rockwell, you know, a bunch of Norman Rockwell illustrations. That was my life. Then I went to a white bubble college. And so I came at the age of 22. I entered the working portion of my life utterly clueless, with no idea that I was clueless about how our big social systems and our history had actually unfolded in the United States. And by the way, I was a history major.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I find myself at the intersection of arts and education. That's my entire career leading up to age 48. I'm working in schools. I'm working in nonprofits. I'm doing a lot of after-school programming for, air quotes, inner city, underprivileged kids and neighborhoods. And for the first time in my life, at the age of 22, I start encountering neighborhoods that are as far from my little suburban world as could be. Dilapidated buildings, schools that are overcrowded, you know, broken windows. The difference was so stark. And those dilapidated neighborhoods were invariably populated by Black folks specifically, not even Black and brown, Black folks. And I completely misread the situation. And I would say I was socialized to misread the situation. I've been taught that the playing field in the U.S. is level. That's the whole point. We're the land of opportunity, the land of the free. And so when I looked at any given individual, my assessment was you were making it or not, you were achieving or not, based completely on your own individual merit. That was what I was taught.
Yes.
So I incorrectly assume that these Black neighborhoods are people who don't know how to get ahead. Like there's a flaw with those people, as opposed to what I would go on to learn, the systems that had been intentionally constructed to segregate and then differentially resource us. So when I learned the truth, I was enraged that I'd been fed a pack of lies that allowed me to feel superior and then cast judgment on other people.
That's right.
So that's why I wrote the book.
Yes. Well, that's a wonderful explanation. As an African American, as a Black American, we talk about race constantly. not a hardly a day goes by as a Black American or African American do I not, my husband and I do not talk about race. And first of all, one of the reasons why that is because of the uproariousness, I guess, since George Floyd, Donald Trump came into power and all of these things, that's probably spurred it to be more so. But, we also talked about race just about every day when we had a Black president, because there were certain, we live in North Carolina, so there were pockets of people that always wanted to make you feel bad about Barack Obama. We were just discussing this yesterday. So race is hugely important in America. And the reason being is just with what you described. There was always that phrase, I know, and I really admired this story when I learned about it in school, Horatio Alger. I really always admired his story. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, I think it was or is the phrase. And, but what if they always came back to say, well, what if you didn't have any bootstraps to begin with? When you see these dilapidated neighborhoods, it's all their fault. They're lazy. They don't know which path to take. They didn't want to study. They didn't want to do this. They didn't want to do that. They don't have to live that way. But there is a systematic approach of why that even happened. And so I am just glad to hear you even say that and speak the truth that most Black Americans know, but that most white Americans refuse to believe. They refuse to believe it. They refuse to get educated upon it. They just simply refuse. And I've watched the white Americans, especially during this terror reign of Donald Trump that has totally gotten out of hand, dig their heels in now more than ever. And it is horrible to say the least. And certainly people should know that African American people, once George Floyd was killed, we are done. We are done, and more done. So, I think, I don't want to, this is just my assessment. I think if there's just one more thing that happens, we're all going to be very much in trouble because people are truly fed up. It's just gone really way beyond the point of, it's like, when is anybody going to realize how we feel? And it's just been mind boggling. And I'm sorry to get off a track, but once I saw you were coming on my show, I was like, this has just got to be said. And people have got to know really just how deep it is. So your book was published in 2014. And again, this came out of your own assessment and you were enraged. But since 2014, what do you say? It's gotten even worse, don't you think?
Yes. And first of all, I don't think you were off track at all. I mean, this is what a conversation about race looks like. And for white listeners, they might not even know what a conversation sounds like. When I started writing the book, which was in 2010, President Barack Obama, people were starting to say, because it took 4 years to write, people were saying, you really don't need to work on the book anymore because we're about to have a Black president. We're post-racial.
Yeah.
And I absolutely understood that. I would have thought that if I hadn't had, oh, and by the way, the big wake up was in the form of a semester-long course. It pounded me with history and facts that I had never known that caused me start reconstructing my belief system. But I think about what's happened since then. I knew we weren't post-racial because I had started spending time in anti-racist circles. I'd started deepening, having new relationships across race and deepening relationships I already had across race. And the information I was getting is, watch out. We are so not post-racial. There's going to be a massive backlash to this, just like there has been anytime there's been Black advancement. And sure enough, that's what we're seeing.
Sure enough. And so that corroborates what my husband and I and family members and friends have been saying all along. All of this spiral out of control, this whole MAGA type of thing, is all because we had one Black president.
And yes, there was one Black president and there was a Black family in the White House. I think that that was just like viscerally too much for people who are so programmed to believe in white superiority and that white is right and that, you know, Black people should be in a service role or, you know, get sent back to Africa. I mean, for people who have that mindset, that was where we saw all the intense racist unleashing that just stays underground until there's, you know, something like this happens and people let it loose.
Right. They let it loose. Now, listen to this, Debbie. And so it's like, it's never enough. You had a Black president with his Black family. The mother and father are in deeply decent, good citizens, college educated at some of the highest colleges and law degrees of institutions in America and of America. Two darling, beautiful, all-American Black girl daughters. The whole family is beautiful, and et cetera, et cetera. They are what most Black Americans, such as myself, my husband, my friends, my sorority sisters, my link sisters, all of us look up to. Because why? They reflect us. They reflect us. That's just like me and my husband being in the White House, okay? That made that all possible. All of my friends, all of my family, we all look like Michelle and Barack Obama. And so we were like, oh, wow, there we are in the White House. And to have the backlash of people even saying, some people, because most, you know, people were like, oh, Michelle Obama is beautiful. She's very fashion forward. You had those others that were like, oh, she looks like a man. And it's like, are you kidding me? She looks like me. Do I look like a man? Are you crazy? No. So there is this whole thing. I mean, to repeat, just in case nobody gets what I'm saying, is literally most Black Americans who envision themselves as Michelle and Barack Obama, they are a direct reflection of us. They are Black excellence at its top, as at the apex. So for people to have a backlash of that are like, that is completely racist. And, you know, and it's just like, what is it that you're seeing against that? But like you said, it's such a drum beat of what people have been taught and what they believe about themselves. You know,
and so they did everything right, you know? So, you know, they're in the camp of Americans who do everything right according to the norms of whiteness. If a white family does that, goes to Ivy League schools, gets all these higher degrees, are physically beautiful according to the aesthetics of whiteness, you know, they just did everything right. So if that's not good enough, what's good enough? Even before George Floyd's murder, like there was already this growing sense of outrage of what? Like, you're going to be racist towards this family? And in addition to that, the other tension that was building, and all of this, of course, is interconnected, is think of the number of highly publicized, because they were videotapes, Black murders at the hands of police. You know, so also over the course of these 10 years, we've got that happening, which is, I think also, it's let's put these people, air quotes, back in their place. And you don't have to know that consciously to be engaged in doing that. That's that's one of the scariest pieces about this, is how unconscious it is.
Well, let me tell you this little piece again. I'm coming from North Carolina. Now, North Carolina is a beautiful, wonderful place full of beautiful, wonderful people. Okay, I will tell you that. So, but I do live in the South. But you know, I don't live in the deep South, but I do live in the South. So, connecting what you were just talking about all the Black people that had died at the hands of police. And for a time period there, it was back to back to back, at least in the eyesight of Black people. It was like every other week, every other day, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmad that was in that neighborhood, and the
Aubrey.
men chased him down and running him down. There, they were like Barney Fife and Gomer Pyle on the Andy Griffith Show doing a citizen's arrest. It was just mind-boggling of all these people being chased down for being Black. And that was it. Now, I'm not saying all of the people involved were going to end up with a good deed, but I'm saying they were first judged just based on Black. Our Black faces are criminalized. Okay. The first assumption is he's going to steal. He's going to kill. She's going to do this. She's going to do that. And, in our society, again, we were just in Charleston yesterday. My husband was shopping, and even Black people have been colonized with these same thoughts that he or she's going to steal. So he had a Black man, following him around in the store. Me and my husband are some of the epitomes of we can go shopping. We can go shopping. We could almost buy out your whole store. But, but if you're going to follow us around like we're a thief, we got a problem with that. This entire thing is institutionalized in our society. Now, to go back, once these people were being killed back to back to back, or so it seemed, then the backlash was, well, back the blue. Back the police. Let the police, and this is how it read to us, let the police kill all the Black people that they just are minorly suspicious of. Let yourself get stopped at a traffic stop and you're going to be killed. Let's just kill them. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's backlash. We could care less about how Black people feel about other Black people being hunted down in America and killed at traffic stops. And we have had to have, as people should know by now, that Black people have had to have the conversation with our sons, with our daughters, about how we are supposed to proceed. So we have to live in a tight box and always be careful. Always look this way, always look that way, because your Black face is criminalized. Mm-hmm. What do you think about those thoughts?
If I could have counted the number of times you said, didn't think Black people mattered, the group coming together and calling themselves Black Lives Matter. For me, that was like such a tender, heartfelt phrase. I'm tearing up right now with the phrase Black Lives Matter. Like, do we really need to say that? Like, yeah,
we had to say it because Black people were getting shot every other week.
And yet it got read by so many people as, oh, are you saying the rest of us don't matter? Like, I just heard Francesca Ramsey. I don't know if you know Francesca Ramsey, MTV's Decoded. She's a comedian, a Black woman. And she said, we don't say, oh, I'm marching for breast cancer this weekend and have people say, what about liver cancer? What, it was just such to me, an unbelievably odd response, and very much steeped in the culture of whiteness that teaches us that everything is in binaries. You win or you lose. The idea that we could actually all matter, but some of us aren't mattering yet. And so we have to say, hey, Black Lives Matter. That was lost on so many people. And in fact, just lost and then twisted to, don't point fingers at the police. Blue Lives Matter.
Right. So, yeah. And then all of a sudden, the American flag, which should not, in my opinion, be bastardized in any way, all of a sudden you've got all this blue and black flag. And I'm like, what is that? What kind of flag is that? It's flying on people's stickers on people's trucks and cars. It's flying from houses. And I'm like, what kind of thing is that? And, again, I don't believe that the American flag should be discolored or reiterated, maybe in art, but not as the formulated as to be sold and to represent America. So, it's just a whole thing. And people feel these things and they know these things. And I think America is just a tinderbox. Now, on this channel, we say Trump is horrible. So horrible Trump this weekend was saying if he doesn't win, it's going to be a bloodbath. What kind of word is that? And what is he saying?
And the fact that he has any following saying that really speaks volumes, because when he says bloodbath, we know exactly whose blood he's talking about.
Exactly, exactly. And let's
Um,
just go back to that. Not that this is what your book is about, but the first time I heard him make fun of a handicapped person, and this was almost maybe 10 years
I
ago, I was
remember
like,
that.
why would we want to elect a man to the presidency who makes fun of disabled people? He
Mm.
shouldn't have been elected just for that one thing alone. Reason why I'm bringing him up so much so is that this is how he's making his money. This is how he's doing race baiting, which every
Mhm.
time it seemed like a black person was doing that in years past, it was like, oh, that's race baiting. Well, this is definitely his whole presidency and campaign is based on race baiting. This is where all of this stuff has been stoked thanks to him and the whole MAGA congregation.
And thanks to actually the founding fathers and colonizers before them who invented anti-Blackness in the United States as a conquer and
Mhm.
divide tool. Because if all
Mhm.
of your workers are united across race, religion, ability, and all these other socially constructed identities, then the minority of the opulent, which is actually a
Mhm.
phrase that James Madison used, that
Mhm.
small power group at the top of the big pyramid scheme, if you don't conquer and divide your workers, you won't survive. And so
Exactly.
race was the tool. There's an incredible book called Birth of a White Nation that tells the story, the legal story, and it's in very accessible terms. Because I'm not a legal scholar and I was able to understand it. It tells the story of how the word white got invented in order to
Yes.
create black, because you can't have
Right.
black without white. So
Right.
that's a really compelling read and helped me understand that it's so in our roots. And when you
Right.
say, the United States is a tinderbox, in 2010, when I made the decision to write this book, I was saying to people around me, this is a tinderbox. This is a disaster waiting to happen,
It
because
is.
you've got half the people believing that the country is a level playing field, and I described the beliefs that I grew up with, and then contrast that to the actual history and the way systems and structures and the overarching ideology that we do not all have equal value. When you put those two things side by side, they're completely incompatible. And
Right.
so that's when people say we're so polarized, the system is broken. My thought is the system is working precisely as it was designed to work. And we
Yes.
need to understand the system if for those of us who truly want life, liberty, justice for all, and I like replacing it with life, liberation, justice for all, we have
Mhm.
to understand the way systems have been constructed so we can redesign them and really have that freer, fairer world that I grew up being taught I was already living in.
Right. Correct. Correct. Now let's take a little bit of a dive into your book. Let's talk maybe about two chapters out of your book that you address. And if you could, for the audience here today, give us some feedback of what you address in your book. Two topics.
So, from a systemic perspective, I really couldn't understand when people talked about systemic racism, especially at the beginning of the course. I was just like, what? Like, what are we talking about? So, here's the example that really was so shocking to me. It has to do with World War II and the GI Bill, post World War II
Okay.
and the GI Bill. So, my dad had been in the Navy. I knew about the GI Bill, which was a four-pronged benefits package from the government to returning veterans. My dad had used the education prong to go to Harvard Law School for free.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh,
he
wow.
had used, yeah, and he had used the housing prong to buy my parents' first home in Winchester. That was the suburb, for
Right.
$17,000. And so in that course, I'm watching this film, Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's a documentary. And I
Mm-hmm.
hear they're talking about the GI Bill. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I know all about the GI Bill. Yeah, yay.
Mm-hmm.
Warm, fuzzy feelings about the GI Bill. Then I hear this one sentence that changes my life. The 1.2 million Black GIs who also fought in World War II were mostly unable to access the GI Bill. And it broke it down. It's not that the GI Bill said it was a white-only bill. It's that it functioned as a white-only bill because there were already barriers throughout all of U.S. systems and structures that made it difficult to impossible for Black folks to attain higher education, to get a home
Right.
loan. And on the home loan front, what was happening was, so we're talking 1940s. In the
Mhm.
1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president. He inherits the fallout from the Great Depression. He creates
Mhm.
this massive economic stimulus program called the New Deal. Part of that
Right.
is building all this new residential housing stock because we're putting Americans back to work again. That's part of
Right.
what they're doing. But you've got people who are still flattened by the Depression, flattened economically, and you've got all this new housing stock. How do you bridge that gap? It's the 30s is the moment in US history where the mortgage gets invented.
Mm.
And in inventing the mortgage, two new government agencies get formed, the FHA and a home and loan corporation. And together they figure out, how are we going to give mortgages away? Like, what are our lending parameters? And they come up with two guidelines that get used by the government and become recommendations for all private banks in the country. And they're
Okay.
this. If you're going to make a loan to a home, make sure it's not dilapidated. Makes perfect sense to me. Who wants to sink money into a home that's falling apart?
Right.
Condition number 2 says our United States government is the skin color of the people living in the neighborhood around that home. The exact language is the presence of even one or two non-white families can undermine real estate values. So based on this government warning around race, a process of redlining happens. And this is where every town and city, many towns and city roll out maps and they engage in this process where they outline in red neighborhoods where the Black folks live. And they outline in green, not just where white people live, but white people already of a certain class, like that all-American father knows best family, not impoverished white people, not necessarily working class, already doing well white people. That GI Bill is good in the green neighborhoods, the green line neighborhoods, never the red, sometimes one of the other neighborhoods. But the reason a Black or brown GI can't attain the housing portion of the GI Bill, that loan, is because he can't get into a neighborhood where it's being offered.
Right.
So systemic racism is when a person or a group has the power to embed their negative or positive towards those special white people,
Right.
embed those biases into systems where hundreds, thousands, millions of people are going to be affected.
Yes.
And to
Yes.
give a sense of scale for the listeners, $120 billion, which would be $2 trillion in today's dollars, got transferred government coffers into the hands of private citizens through that housing portion of that bill. And 98% of that wealth went to white people.
Of course. Of course.
So that's a chapter in the book.
Wow. Wow. Well, here's a fun fact. A few years back, myself and my siblings, we were having a kind of a land feud with a person, some land that's adjacent to our family home. And so it caused me to had to dig up my parents' the original deed. And so upon reading that and not having that in front of me, but it did say to some degree, and this was again this is North Carolina, this is textile in area, former textile area. So there were mill villages. So the actual houses were at the time, some of them were rented to people by the mill that they worked in. And so in this particular case, it was Burlington Industries. Well, my parent had their house built. So our original home was built by a Black man, and my parents bought it. But in the original deed, it said no land, no housing should be sold to a Negro citizen. It said it blatantly in that. Now, I don't know, my siblings are a generation ahead of me, so I don't know the ins and outs of how actually my parents did acquire, were able to buy the home, but that's what it said in the original documentation.
That's so interesting. So that's called a racial covenant. So that's different than redlining. So in addition to redlining, there were racial covenants that were totally normalized where you could say this property can never be sold to a Black person, or this
Wow.
property must be sold to another white person.
Right. Right.
So,
Right. Right.
I mean, multiple tricks and tools were used to keep Black people out of white neighborhoods, and not just Black. I mean, for a time it was Jewish people. Then they got to
Yeah.
become
Sure.
white.
Right.
Jewish people got to become white at a certain point
Yeah.
legally.
Yes.
Racism very much, it's a legal construct. It's
Right.
social, it's legal. Yeah. So, wow, that would be a really interesting story to uncover. Sometimes
Yes.
the way a Black family would get property, like your parents did, I'm not saying this is your family story, but what I have heard is that a white family, white allies, would buy the house and then they would
Oh.
sell it. They would sell it to Black friends.
Right, right, right. Now that was, I'm pretty sure, because they would have said that. They would have told me. I would have heard that story. I will have to reach back out to one of my older siblings to see what happened there. But unless somehow, some way, that was the original, and then maybe things changed, I'm not sure. But they bought their house in the late 1940s. So there you go.
So all
Ugh.
of those, those covenants, yuck, is right. And you know, and think about what housing for many white people, where most of our wealth comes from, or much of our wealth comes from, is our homes.
Yes, that's your first step.
Yeah, homes in white neighborhoods have increasingly, since the 1940s and those original mortgages, they've just appreciated in wealth, and that is not
Yes.
necessarily true in
Right.
those redlined neighborhoods. And so when we think about intergenerational wealth, well, when my parents died, that $17,000 home they bought had appreciated to $1 million. And when they die, that comes to me and my siblings, not to mention my father's earnings from that great law career he had because he went to Harvard Law School. So there's just, it's just layers and layers of advantage, which we could call privilege, and layers and layers and layers of disadvantage or discrimination.
Yes, most definitely. And then when you think about someone, just driving through a dilapidated neighborhood, so to say, and for people to look down on other people and then sneer at them, it's like, well, you caused this. This is the situation that you caused. This is what happens, So, but here's another fun fact. My husband's Jewish father, he has a Jewish father, and he lived on Long Island. He bought his house for $14,000 on Long Island. And when when his son asked him to come to Connecticut to live in an assisted living facility, he sold his house for $750,000. And so it's kind of akin to your story there. But, there's that layer of advantage and etc. that you get to have.
And think about, so public education in the United States is paid for by property tax. And so, this explains why those buildings in the neighborhoods I was in had school buildings that were overcrowded with broken windows and, all these old books. I also noticed that their textbooks were old. And my interpretation before waking up was, oh, boy, these people really, quote unquote, these people don't really care about education. Of course, I have a completely different interpretation. Very few parents don't care about education. Most parents understand that it's a building block to the so-called American dream. Exactly. But you look at the suburb I grew up in. I was over there the other day, and my middle school, which seemed like a perfectly good school to me, has been razed, and they're building a brand new one. And it's true. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're just always building these fancy new buildings and getting the cutting edge technology. And that's because the resources to do it are based in that real estate piece. And that real estate piece is rooted in those 1930s policies, are rooted in the very ideology that we aren't all equal and that white people are more valuable and deserve more.
Yes, yes, yes. Based on what you just said, I've always said this. So I'm very fortunate to live on, I guess, the quote unquote good side of town or whatever. But I've always said, when I drive around the Charlotte area, the Gastonia area, which is where I'm at, I noticed, I was like, why do all the wealthy people have all the great architecture in their area? I mean, the buildings are beautiful, the grass is always green and cut at an angle and beautiful flowers, and you just go a few blocks away, to another side of town and it looks terrible and it's just miserable. And I always thought, well, why can't, that was the naiveness. I went through my own naive period as well, that I just didn't realize until now, really.
Yeah. And, I've seen Charlotte's, I can send you, if you haven't seen it, Charlotte's redlining map. I know Charlotte's redlining map.
I'd love to see that. I would love to see that because I'm a native of the area. I live in Gastonia, but I'm a native of this area. I would love to see that.
Yeah. And, there are very few places I've spoken in Charlotte, and there are very few places I've ever gone where I can't find a redlining map.
Wow.
Just thousands of them all over the country.
Oh, my goodness. And so they still exist? Are they still being used by real estate and banks?
I think legally, no. And yet the footprint exists. The footprint was laid down. Right. And realtors, I mean, this is why we have all these fair housing attempts at fair housing acts, but realtors, like teachers, like doctors, like people who hire in corporations, are mired in their own bias and potentially not realizing that they're steering white home purchasers to white neighborhoods and people who aren't white to whatever other neighborhood feels like a quote unquote fit. And so, realtors, my husband's a realtor, real estate people are just as susceptible as anybody to have their bias get enacted through behavior.
Yes, true. I think about a neighborhood, a well-established, well-heeled neighborhood in Charlotte called Myers Park. It's very beautiful. I was just over there the other day. Very beautiful, very stately homes. And then they're building these new modern homes, but not too modern. They still flow with the beautiful colonial homes. And I just wonder what goes on there. I wonder how many Black families live in Myers Park. I know there's some Black people that live in Myers Park that they let get in, but I just wonder what the real estate lingo or behavior is for Myers Park.
Well, I know that, look at the language you use, that they let in, like they. The they is definitely going to be the white folks. And for any white listeners, that's us. Winchester, the suburb that I grew up in, has gone through a process of, can we have some more mixed housing, which means that not every home in the neighborhood is X square feet and sort of in the X price range, but could we have, because imagine if we had neighborhoods that were full of mixed housing, we would have people up and down the class structure. We would have people probably, it would be more multi-generational, it would be more multi-ethnic, it may be more multi-religious. And that's the vision that people like I'm pushing for. Let's have that diverse world that I thought America was so proud of. Right. But the NIMBY, not in my backyard, where people are all for a program until it's going to actually, they think, impact them. So not in my backyard. So in Winchester, there was all this work done and people were like, yay, mixed housing, until it got put in their neighborhood. And they're like, oh, actually, I'm not interested in that.
Right.
So that's a problem. Yeah, it's a really intractable problem to create. And the other thing is how, for a Black family to move into a affluent white neighborhood in hopes of attaining, social connections, of maybe better schools, for all those reasons, that now you're really more isolated. Now your Black kids have to face a level of scrutiny and racism that they don't have to face if they stay in neighborhoods that are more likely to have people who look like them and who practice the same cultural values. Because the cultural values in those white spaces, I can tell you because I grew up in it, it's very much about individualism and achievement, buying into all the cultural norms of whiteness, which are not warm, fuzzy, authentic, relational. It's about achievement. And
Right.
from all of my friends and colleagues in Black communities, I understand a really different set of cultural values where relationship and family and sharing resources and having one another's back,
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
backstabbing, there's a really stark difference culturally. And so
Right.
is a Black family willing to give all that cultural connectedness up to step
Right.
into that white neighborhood? It's just an
Right.
impossible situation.
Right. I will tell you because it's a full disclosure here. A conversation my husband and I have had with his brother and his wife is that, we refuse to go on vacation where we knowingly know we're going to be the only Black people there. We don't want to do that anymore. We had done it for years and years, and but we're just not interested in that anymore because we don't want to be exposing ourselves to feeling some type of way, being out there for somebody to say something stupid to us. We
The
just don't want to
opposite
go
of,
there.
yeah, that's not a vacation. It's like you need a
No.
vacation. You need a vacation from the stuff that happens every day.
Right, exactly. So, if where we're going for vacation can't be mixed culturally and have a good percentage, we know that as African Americans, our percentage against the white population is a lot lower. We can understand that. But if it can't be a well inviting atmosphere with at least some mix of different groups of people, we're just not interested in going. We're
Yeah,
just not interested,
that sounds like a healthy choice.
Yes. Now, so this weekend, I belonged to a group called the Links Incorporated. And so we took an overnight trip to the International African American Museum in Charleston, which was just opened this past fall. And I took a lot of pictures. I had been there before, but I also took pictures of some of the things that were said there. So there was one thing I took a picture of, and I just thought, you know what, this just encapsulates everything. This is the scramble for Africa, is what this is saying. In the late 1800s, European colonialism expanded into Asia, various Pacific islands, the Middle East, and Africa. Though European leaders promoted colonialism as the white man's burden to civilize colonized people, they primarily sought to extract resources and labor and to establish strategic trade and military locations. In Africa, leaders fiercely resisted colonialism, but by the 1900 empires in Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain divided and colonized the continent. Only Liberia and Ethiopia remained independent. That white man's burden, that you mentioned something called saviorism syndromes. Is the white man's burden, is that the same thing?
I think they're cousins. Yeah. So when I was encountering those schools and those neighborhoods, my impulse was I wasn't going to extract, minerals or anything, but it's the same mindset.
It's the same mindset.
I am superior, and therefore I am going to be I'm 22 years old. I know nothing
Right.
about how the world actually works, but just by looking at you, I think I can help you. And actually, you know
You
what?
gotta save you from yourself.
Got to save you, and I know how to do it because I'm going to have you be more like me. Which is Christianized, anglicized, conform to the white culture. And what's really gross, and this is what a very robust anti-racist practice looks like, which I have a very robust anti-racist practice because I've set out to do that. I could ask myself, was I exploiting and extracting anything? And I told you I wasn't, but when I think about it, I was, because it made me look good to my organization. I was able to raise a lot of money to address these inner city issues, and that made my star rise in the nonprofit world. So I was I was extracting something that was going to serve me.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same model playing out with one white woman on some neighborhoods.
Right. Now let's flip to this one, Plessy versus Ferguson. So you know about that, but for the audience, I'm going to read this. So in the late 1800s, white Southern state and local leaders implemented policies that increasingly disenfranchised Black voters and passed a series of racial segregation laws. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws in Plessy versus Ferguson, which permitted separate public facilities of equal equality. In practice, the separate but equal doctrine was rarely enforced. Segregated public schools and other facilities designated for Black people were typically neglected, underfunded, or non-existent. Now, let's stop that right there and let me go over to this. I'm going to take three people that's been prominent in our world recently. Nikki Haley. She has consistently said, oh, America's not racist. It's not racist. But here we go with Plessy versus Ferguson. What would you teach Nikki Haley in this light of day based on her statement that America's not racist? And she is supposedly a woman of color.
Yeah, so we don't know, is she actually as ignorant as I was once upon a time? Has she completely bought into the American dream? My family did it, so can you. And she does not know her history. Or is she just playing to her base? We don't know. But I'm going to assume, because she said it, she doesn't know. I would say to her, there is so much history that you would need to know. Let's take Plessy versus Ferguson, which is... Now, remember, we talked about the backlash to having a Black president. Dr. Carol Anderson, who's a brilliant scholar, Emory, who wrote a book called White Rage, she talks about the cycles throughout U.S. history where Black advancement leads to a giant backlash. And she uses post-emancipation as an example of one of those cycles. So Plessy versus Ferguson is happening 30 years or so after emancipation. And the South is frantically trying to find a new legal system to replace enslavement. And the Jim Crow laws, that's what they're coming up with. And so Plessy versus Ferguson is a historic moment in that process where, we're not going to be an integrated society. We are going to be separate. And I hear people say to me, and I believe that they really don't know their history, and they say, but, you know, the playing field, like, my great-grandparents came here from Italy or Ireland or Germany or Russia. They had 2 cents in their pocket. They were treated like dirt. They didn't speak English. Took a couple generations, but, you know, that American dream is real. So when people use their individual experience to try to explain the whole wide world, it's a signal that you need to get out of your own way and understand the much bigger world. Because U.S. racism sits inside of a larger colonization project, which sits inside of imperialism, which is all what you were referring to when you were talking about the European conquest of the African nation.
Exactly.
And it looks at just the similarities. You go anywhere in the world and it will look a little different region to region, but the big pieces of oppression and subjugation and domination, that looks remarkably similar.
Yes, most definitely. We're going to take our second person, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. So let's pretend, Debbie, that you are a citizen of Florida. And let's say you have school-aged children. And in Florida, which is why my husband and I are boycotting, we would love to go to Florida. We love the Keys. We love Clearwater. We want to go on vacation in Florida so bad. But we refuse to give our money and our presence in Florida because of Ron DeSantis and the book bannings and the not teaching Black history in Florida. You know, the sentiment is he doesn't want, you know, white children to feel bad, but it's not to feel bad. It's to know better, not to feel bad, know better. So what would you, if you had a chance to talk to him, what would you tell him?
Unlike Nikki Haley, I don't have any trust that he's a man who wants to know or do better. When I think about what he did by putting Central and South Americans on planes and shipping them to Martha's Vineyard.
Yes.
that's just sadistic in my book. And so one of my colleagues often says there's some pancakes that can't be flipped. I think Ron DeSantis
Yeah.
is a pancake that can't be flipped. I think
Yes.
he's committed to some pretty sick ideas. But if he were somebody who were coming from a place of ignorance, I would tell him the story of the time that I did a 20-minute presentation on redlining to a group of fifth graders in Denver, Colorado at a private school. And there were maybe 50 kids in the room. And there were a lot of teachers, like 12 teachers for those 50 kids, because we understood that it could be upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was giving the talk, I always ask people to turn and talk after I've given my presentation to kind of share their ideas with each other. And I had watched this one kid walk in at the beginning, and I was like, oh, there's the alpha boy. He was this like super good looking, according to white standards, a white kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was super charismatic. Everybody seemed to love him. Everyone's giving him high fives. So I scanning the room with my eyes, and I watch his group, and I can see that he is really agitated. And when it comes time to go from the small group to the whole group, and I say, hey, let's share out. What'd you talk about? His is the first hand to raise. And I think he's going to give it to me. I think he's going to say, this isn't true. This is racist to make this presentation. No. What he says to me is something I will never forget. He said, I am so angry. Why did it take till I'm this age to teach me this?
Wow.
I had shown a redlining map of Denver, and he could see where his neighborhood was. He could see where the school was.
Right.
And so there may be some kids who are uncomfortable. There
Right.
are also kids who, and I know so many people, white people, and also, of course, people of color, because we're all in the same limited education system, who,
Right.
when they learn, say, why didn't I know this sooner? This explains so much.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and if kids are feeling bad, it's because I think teachers haven't been educated enough about how to teach this and hold the space in a way that allows everybody to feel some sense of, accountability, a desire to do better.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be. When white kids walk away feeling shamed and blamed, there are pieces of that educational process that haven't been done well.
Correct. I believe that as well.
And not because these teachers aren't smart, not because
Right.
they don't have big hearts, because very few places in our educational system teaches our educators, by the way, 85% who are white and mostly women. You can't teach what you don't know. You can't lead where you won't go.
Right.
And so
Correct.
really good people can hold the system in place and can create a really uncomfortable conversation just out of lack of skill.
Right. Correct. Very, very good thought to have there. Now, the last but not least group of people I'm going to ask you to speak to, and it's a wide berth because 70 million people voted for Donald Trump in the last election. What would you say to the MAGA crowd?
Well, I would ask them what they like about Donald Trump. If I truly had a chance, it's so important that I don't do the same thing that got us in this mess. I can't dehumanize and otherize people who feel like they have nothing to do with me. You must be a horrible person to be in MAGA. If I start there, I won't get anywhere. So I have to authentically want to understand.
Right.
This is white people's work. I don't think any person of color should ever have to have this conversation with a MAGA person, but we white people are related to them. So, what do you like? What do you see? And then I love asking people, what are your values? Tell me more about your value system. And so how does Donald Trump align? How does the MAGA movement align with your value system?
Right. Exactly.
And most people do believe in honesty and fairness and kindness. And when you start thinking about your own values and you look at Donald Trump, is there honesty? No. Is there fairness? No. Is there kindness? No. So what is it that allows you to vote into the highest office in the world somebody who doesn't align with any of your values?
Right. Exactly. Very good point. Now, I wanted that to be the end of the story. But I have to go back and say this to you. What do you think about, like, going back to the young man in school that talking about the redlining? He was like, how's it? I'm just now finding this out. You know, I don't think a lot of people put together schools, private schools or otherwise, that opened in 1967, 68, between that 65 to 70, that opened because of the desegregation of schools. I don't think a lot of people connect that. Now, and I don't think a lot of younger people, especially younger people, they're really not connecting that. What would you address? Have you addressed people with the fact that the desegregation of schools, there was a lot of private schools that opened just because of that?
Yeah. So, and in the North, there was a different wave. The wave of opening private schools in the North happened around 1900. That was when our largest immigration wave in the United States happened. And those were European immigrants. So those were also people who weren't considered white at first, Irish, that what we call the white ethnics, Jewish people, Irish people, Italian people, Polish people. And so people like my family, we wouldn't want our kids going to school with those people. So that was the cause of a lot of private schools opening, being established in New England and in the East Coast.
Right.
I'm wondering if it's more of a Southern thing. And that's that not in my backyard.
Yes.
You know, when you think about, I don't know if you have read The Sum of Us. So this is a really good book. And, you know, she opens with a story about public swimming pools. And when
that was the whole thing.
Right. And so when the law said we have to be integrated, what happened was public pools got shut down. They got filled with concrete because the white perspective by people who advocated for that was, I would rather not have my kids in a pool at all. I'd rather have them under a sprinkler or swelter on a hot day than be in a pool with black kids.
Oh my God.
And this is that whole, just such a weird ideology that like your skin is going to turn brown. You're going to get dirty. You're like, why can't we be in water together? But that it's very twisted.
Very twisted. Debbie, I have just enjoyed this interview. I'll ask you one other question. If you were to rewrite your book, Waking Up White, what would you write different?
I wouldn't change a thing. Wouldn't change a thing. Because it's designed to be the 101 for white people. And I have been shocked. I've been shocked at the utility the book has had for people of color too, but I primarily designed it for all the reasons you and I are talking about, as a 101 for white people. I am definitely working on a second book, but I wouldn't touch Waking Up White because it's a tool and it has been so effective. It did what I hoped it would do.
Yes. So. Well, I have just really enjoyed you. I really appreciate you coming on the Bookaholic podcast. And Debbie, we will have all of your contact information and access to the book in the podcast show notes, as well as in the YouTube description box below. Okay. Thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely, Deirdre. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, thank you.